Now, in your book, Richard, The Greatest Show on Earth, you also, of course, talk about the creationists who have this theory that the world really only started 10,000 years ago, and that your sort of views and those of Darwin are ridiculous. And you have described them. You've said in your book, those who think the world began less than 10,000 years ago are deluded to the point of perversity. I mean, can you explain why is there a cohort, a very large cohort of people who don't subscribe to Darwin's theories, even though, you know, there is ample evidence to show that what he's saying is correct, and they believe that the world just started 10,000 years ago?
Well, the 10,000 years is particularly egregious. I mean, but that's just dopey. It's just plain daft. It's wrong by an immense margin. As we talked about earlier, the true age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years, so that the degree of error is just colossal. And it falls foul not just of the facts of biology, but of geology and astronomy and history and chemistry and physics and everything. I mean, nothing that we know about the world would make sense if it really was that young. Nothing that we know about the universe would make sense. So it is an extraordinary piece of perverse illogicality and wanton ignorance. It's very hard to explain why anybody would want to do that. The immediate reason is because they want to believe that the Book of Genesis is true.
And all the stuff about Noah's Ark and all the rest of it, yeah.
Now, as you know, every people in the world has its origin myths, its creation myths, and they're often poetically very beautiful. And it's if anybody who'd studied a bit of anthropology would know that the Judeo-Christian creation myth, which is what is in the Book of Genesis, is just one of hundreds of creation myths, and there's no reason to believe that one any more than any other, and there's no reason indeed to believe any of them, because they're all written without benefit of science, and they're all just plain wrong.
But isn't it that they have a in the Christian case, they have a Christian agenda? They want to spread Christianity in these schools. We saw it particularly during George W. Bush's two eras of administration, that there was a very big push among conservative Christian, neo-Christian Americans to try and get this into the educational curriculum, to try and push this notion that the world only began 10,000 years ago.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm not the person to try to explain that. It is the most remarkable fact that if you've got a political agenda of that sort, why would you push something which is just manifestly absurd? I mean, you could also, and all sorts of other things you could push, and they do, of course. But to pick on something so palpably ridiculous as that the world is only 10,000 years old, it just boggles the mind. In a way, it boggles the mind even more that there are so many of them.
Are they, the Christian ones principally, is this principally driven by American Christians, or does it extend way beyond that?
Well, there are strands of it in other Christians. There's quite a bit in Australia and actually in Britain as well. So no, it's not entirely American, but I think much of the influence comes from America. But
they are still pushing to try and get their theories of creationism taught in schools in America.
Well, yes, they are. It's difficult for them politically because the Constitution of the United States separates church and state. You can't teach religion in schools. And so in public schools. So they do have to think of various dodges, ways to get around that. A lot of them homeschool their children, take them out of school, so that to protect them from scientific education.
And you also mention in your book, you talk about the Islamic creationists as well. That was the first time I had come across that term, because I thought creationism, the theory of it, was usually associated with Christians, neo-Christians. What's the agenda of the Islamic creationists?
Well, I don't know much about that, but my understanding is that they're taught that the Quran is the literal word of God, and so it must be true. Whereas most Christians, I say most Christians, it's still true that most Christians don't actually believe it's literally true. So there is that problem. My colleague Steve Jones in London says he's increasingly finding that in his lectures on genetics, he's getting kind of opposition from Muslim students who are perfectly happy to learn about genetics, but not evolution. There are Muslim creationists who don't insist that the world is old. Sorry, that the world is young. They'll allow that the world is old,
yes,
but they don't think that any evolution's happened. I mean, they think that creatures, all species were created as they are now, but they don't necessarily insist that it was as recent as 10,000 years ago.
But they still subscribe to the view that life on Earth came about because of their particular God, whether
Yes.
it is an Islamic God or a Christian God or a Judaism, or whether it's also from Judaism. That's their principal view.
Yes, it was that all living things were separately created by God.
And what about, if you go back to your book, Richard, The Greatest Show on Earth, you also talk about the likes of insects, which has been very interesting, and that flowers were formed from millions of years, I think you described it, of sculpture from insects.
Yes.
Tell me about that, the evolution of plant life.
Well, flowers are sex organs. They are devices for propagating, for moving pollen onto stigmas, from the male to the female. And there are various ways of doing that, and wind is one way. And you just spray pollen into the wind, and the wind just sprays it, scatters it all over the place. And some of it happens to end up on the stigma of the right species. But there are more direct ways of doing that. And one of the ways is to bribe insects to carry the pollen. Give the insects a bribe of nectar, or pollen itself, actually, because the insects may eat some of the pollen or give it to their larvae. Give them a bribe, which causes them to visit flowers, and then they go and visit another flower, and if it happens to be a flower of the right species, then it's a much more direct way of transferring the pollen. And the real silver bullet way of doing it is to have have an insect that will only visit one type of flower, so it's guaranteed to take the pollen to the right kind of flower. And there are certain orchids which are only ever visited by one species of insect, and the insect only ever visits one species of flower. So they're highly specialized. There are figs that are the same, and that's the magic bullet end of the spectrum. There are some flowers that, and flowers of course have bright colours and beautiful scents as well, to act as advertisements to attract the insects. So they're sort of bribing the insects and fueling the insects with nectar to act as ferries to carry the pollen. There are some orchids, again, that don't actually bribe the insects with nectar, but mimic female insects. So there are bee orchids where the flower looks like a female bee. The male bee attempts to copulate with the flower because it looks like a female bee, and in so doing becomes covered with pollen, or gets the pollen balls from the orchid, and then goes off and tries to copulate with another bee orchid.
Yeah. And
there are fly orchids and spider orchids and various other kinds of orchids.
And is all life on this planet evolving all the time? Are we as human beings evolving all the time, for example?
Well, it's a bit controversial whether we want to say that they're evolving all the time. Potentially, all life is evolving all the time, but it looks as though actually evolution is a very much sort of stop and go process, and it may go for a long time without very much evolutionary change, and then maybe a bit of evolutionary change may be quite rapid. So it's not a slow and steady continuous process necessarily, and so it's not obvious that we are evolving at this moment. We may be and we may not be.
Yeah, especially when you say that actually we've kind of been around in our present form, give or take a couple of changes, for the last 100,000 years.
Well, 100,000 years is not long by evolutionary status.
Yeah.